Okay.
Hi, everybody. Oh
Hey.
my God, I'm so excited. So, this is like a kind of special live. I don't just, I just do my lives on Wednesday and blah, blah, blah. But I have this guy that I met on the internet. That sounds so creepy. But
On Twitter, like but not on naughty Twitter, on polite Twitter.
right, on X. So, and it's Ben, as you see, sitting here. And Ben is this really awesome dude who's just such a great journalist. And, I had been missing good journalism. And you just really just did stuff that sucked me into you. And I think that you're so great and you really show what journalism is about. And I connected with you on the pediatric children stuff, which you really did such great and are doing great work on. And so before I keep before I keep kissing your butt, I want you to introduce yourself
Sure.
to everybody, please. So this is Ben. So introduce yourself.
Thanks. Thanks a lot for having me on. It's great to sort of interface with you. So I'm Benjamin Ryan. I've been working as a health and science journalist for the past about 23 years. My original specialty was writing about HIV. I wrote for Pause magazine, but I was their
Wow.
science writer for 8 years. So that was a real boot camp in covering science about HIV and cancer and viral
Great.
hepatitis. And it was also a boot camp in starting to sort of take a step back and analyze to see when sometimes science and advocacy was overlapping a bit too much,
Mhm.
and it was keeping scientists from being as honest as they might be. I covered the HIV prevention pill a lot, and I was very struck in the early years of PrEP, as it's known, how insistent all the doctors and the researchers were that PrEP was not associated with a decline in condom use or an acceleration in a pre-existing decline in condom use. And this
Great.
was just common sense. All you had to do was ask anyone, like, why do you want to take PrEP? They're like, to not use condoms. And I remember bringing this up with Bob Grant from UCSF, University
Yeah.
of California, San Francisco, who was basically the godfather of PrEP, was the author of the main study that first proved that it worked in 2010.
Mhm.
And I said to him in early 2014, I just almost offhandedly, yeah, my friends want to go off condoms. That's why they're interested in PrEP. And he blew up at me. He lost his mind. He got so angry. That's not true. None of my patients say that. And that was a real beginning and a real crash course
Wow.
of what happens when, yeah, you see your patients and you hear what they tell you, but you're not taking a bird's eye view look at the data, and you're not looking around to what maybe is a more real world example of what's truly happening. And I would see it in
Yes.
conferences, galore. So, gotten a lot of tussles with HIV activists over the years about different things. In particular, the claim, which was never really supported by evidence, that the high list price of Truvada, the HIV prevention pill, when it was still on brand, was the predominant limiting factor for uptake of HIV prevention pill PrEP. And there was never any real evidence for this, but it was like the main cause for activists for years, until finally the drug went off patent and nothing changed. Now it costs next to nothing, and there's still limited uptake in very high
Yeah.
risk groups. Which, that's another thing, is language policing. You're not supposed to say high risk group. That's considered offensive and stigmatizing. So
What?
pardon me, but so again, the HIV world is also very, there's a huge overlap, obviously, with LGBT activism.
Yes.
So
Yes.
there's a lot of concern about language use, and some of it I really agree with. Some of it, I don't see any difference between a homeless person and an unhoused person. That
Right.
language doesn't help homeless
Right.
people,
Right.
for example. But I do believe in certain person first uses of terms like person
Okay.
who injects drugs as opposed to addict or injection drug user, because it
Okay.
really does imply that this is not central to their being. Somebody I know
Right.
who who was diagnosed with diabetes later in life, and they were very ashamed of this. And I said to them, this person said to me with this graveness, like, I'm a diabetic. And I said, did you consider just saying I have diabetes? It might
Right.
distance it from your sense of self if this is something that really bothers you. So in any case, I got into writing about pediatric gender medicine in about 2 years ago.
Okay.
Monkeypox had happened the summer of 2022,
Mhm.
and I actually had cancer at the same time. So it was this very
Oh.
bizarre experience where my side effects from chemo were going up at the same rate that all of the incidents of monkeypox was happening. So I was reporting this and getting sicker and sicker at the same time. So I became slightly famous at the time, partly because of that, but because I was ahead of the ball, because I knew kind of where all the tricks were in reporting about gay people, and the overcompensation of not wanting to offend anyone or stigmatizing, which in this case was leading people to excessively downplay how central monkeypox was to it, how centrally it was transmitting amongst gay men.
Yes.
between, sex between men, if you want to put it very clinically.
Mhm.
And this was not serving gay men well. This was an emergency. They needed clear, direct information. Now, a government accountability office report ultimately confirmed what I always felt and was saying all along, was that the CDC was too muddled in their messaging about monkeypox, and they didn't get very important direct information to the high-risk population clearly when it was needed. They were,
That's right.
I remember being on an LGBTQ journalist conference call with Dimitri Daskalakis, who was the White House deputy lead for monkeypox at the time, came out of the HIV world here in New York City. And I remember the first thing he said was all the exceptions to the rule of who would get monkeypox. And I remember at the time I had a tremor in my voice because of the chemo side effects. And I asked him, I was like, why is it that the first thing that you said, and I sounded like I was about to cry, was, all the exceptions to the rule?
Yeah,
and he just responded by giving himself a great pat on the back for the great job he was doing. But these are just examples of how I've experienced, a sense of wariness of what you're told by the experts. And I have great faith in people. My father is a surgeon, my brother, my uncle, my cousin.
Right.
My family is filled with doctors and academics, all over my dad's side of the family in particular. So I put great faith, but I also have high expectations of people who have that level of a degree, of an intellect, of education. Right. And so if I see that they're being dishonest or engaging in subterfuge or whatever it might be, this bothers me in particular because it really lets down what I think the standards to which I would hold those sorts of individuals.
Excellent.
So I got to, monkeypox kind of ended. I was in a recovery period from being in chemo, and I was looking around like, what am I interested in? And that was around the time that there was all that activist pushback of the New York Times coverage of the puberty blocker issue by Megan Twohey, and Reuters also had published that series about pediatric gender medicine at the time. And so I saw this great disconnect between these articles that I were reading that I thought were quite good and addressed important questions fairly, et cetera, and this enraged reaction from activists online and ultimately from GLAAD, with the GLAAD truck driving around the New York Times building in February of 2023. And I had actually had Jesse Singal, a journalist, as an editor a couple of times, writing for New York Magazine in 2016. So I was aware of him just professionally. And, he, of course, had written the very big, splashy article about when kids say they're trans in the Atlantic in 2018. And so I saw that, again, the disconnect between how he was being treated and, described every epithet under the book, a pervert and a jerk and, evil and all these things. And I'm reading these articles and I'm like, these seem good to me. I keep reading and rereading all these articles, by Emily Bazelon in the New York Times Magazine, and, getting to know them as well professionally. I'm like, these are good people. They're super smart. I admire them greatly. I aspire to do as good a job as them, So I started tweeting about, it was the article about Kinnan Ross McKinnon, he researched detransitioning at the University of York. York University, which is in Canada, not to be confused with the University of York, which is in England. And he, had an interview published with Azine Qureshi in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago, which was very good. And there was an article generally about him in Reuters about how little research there was about detransitioning. And I went on Twitter and I said, gee, this would be a good thing to keep studying. We should encourage intellectual inquiry into this important subject. And Alejandra Caraballo, she is a she's a trans activist, and she is a clinical law instructor at Harvard Law School, which is not to say that she's not a professor there, but essentially sort of aids students, Harvard Law students, in their work, et cetera. She went bananas and just launched at me and started just making up all this stuff about me and just trying to scare me off. And that was, having grown up in the culture of bullies, it had nothing to do with my being gay as a child, but like I grew up under the tyranny of some bullies. And so when you grow up in that way, if you're to survive it, you develop a core sense of self. I think of it as this metal rod from my sternum, that no one can touch. And that says, no, I believe in myself, and I'm open to criticism, yet if you're being irrational, I will think you're wrong, and I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing. And so my reaction to that was, I always say this expression, which is, there, if you think of the Wizard of Oz, and then there's something behind the curtain back there, And they're just saying, don't look there. Don't look behind that. There's
Totally.
nothing there. You're like, what is it? Of course you're going to want to look there. So if you have a substantive argument for why you should not study detransitioning, for example, then offer it. But if you don't, and all you have is bullying and anger and lies, then there's definitely something there. So I spent almost a year really researching this subject very intently and reading all these books like Hannah Barnes' Time to Think, etc.
Right.
Articles galore, papers. And at first it was very confusing to me because you would read a paper by somebody with a PhD and it would say one thing with the utmost conviction. And then you'd read another and they'd say the exact opposite. And they'd also have a PhD. And so you're really confounded. So you're left with having to know the lay of the land yourself to be able to determine who is being dishonest and who is not, showing the full hand. And, for example, the American Academy of Pediatrics 2018 policy statement on the gender affirming care method was absolutely savaged in this fact check and criticism by James Cantor, who is a very controversial sex researcher in Toronto. But he, it's indisputable and controvertible that he says these footnotes, these citations that you have in this foundational document for gender affirming care method in the United States do not only don't say what they say you do, they actually contradict it. And in particular, and I have to preface this by saying I am not saying that anyone should put transgender people of any age into conversion therapy, but for the sake of intellectual honesty, it says that conversion therapy is harmful to transgender youth. And then if you look at the citation, the name of the paper is something to the effect of like conversion therapy practices in gay adult men or something like that. And at the time this was true, and since there's been a couple sort of not very high quality studies, but Dr. Cantor says in his paper there are no studies of conversion therapy in transgender youth. And so you really have to wonder, like, these are foundational documents, and then everyone is pointing, they say all of the major medical associations agree that gender affirming care is life-saving and medically necessary. And then you look at the actual documents themselves and they don't hold up to scrutiny. So it really begs the question of who's running this show. The man who wrote that policy statement, Jason Rafferty, he's currently a pediatrician and child psychiatrist at Brown University and Thunder Mist Community Health Center, which is in Rhode Island. He at the time was a resident. He was the only author of that paper. And although it was edited, by a committee, a small group of people, there's this disclaimer on there that says that he is solely responsible for the document, which is funny because when I was writing about the lawsuit that's partly against this policy statement by a detransitioner, I was fact checking or, telling the AAP's comms people what I was going to say. And the only thing that they said back was they disputed that he was the sole author. They said there was multiple authors. I said, not only when you draw up the PDF of the document does it only say his name on the top, and Timothy is all at the bottom, but you yourself put this disclaimer in there that says he's solely responsible, was the sole author. So you can't have it both ways when it's convenient for you.
That's right. So
it ultimately took me almost all last year to finally find publications that were receptive to my covering this subject the way I really would any scientific subject, which is to not cover it from ideological bent, which is not to do what GLAAD said is okay, and not to favor some Republican point of view and use terms like genital mutilation and that sort of thing, which I do not approve of. And
thank you.
They're just hyperbolic, and that doesn't help anyone. Finally, in the end of the year, I just, I had some relationship with some editors from previous gigs I'd had who were at conservative publications at The Sun, New York Sun, and the New York Post, and I just started writing for them. And people will hold that up and try to discredit my work, saying, "Oh, well, you're writing for some conservative rag." And I'm like, so what if I am? Like, it's my work. I stand by it. My editors all know what my policies are, and and I'll just take it somewhere else if they ever wanted to put in language or points of view that I didn't agree with. So
that's right.
So I've done a lot of work covering a lot the intersection of the subject and the law. That's becoming increasingly important, as we all know. Bans on gender transition treatment for children, but also a lot of lawsuits from detransitioners. There are about 24 that have been filed in the last couple of years. And, those are winding their way through the system. It's a slow process, and some of them aren't going to make it. But one so far, Prisha Mosley, I'm sure you've had on your show, from North Carolina, her case has been approved to go to trial. And that'll probably still take a couple of years, her attorneys tell me. But one really big thing is that a fraud count has been approved in her case to go to trial. And that's really perilous for doctors, because they could be on the hook for their personal finances for that. That may not be covered by the malpractice insurance. So that's sort of where we are today and how I ended up in this place. But I find it a very fascinating subject. Obviously, it's very central to politics, But
right.
at the core of it, and I think it's easy when talking heads are shouting about this subject to remember that we're talking about kids, who have a lot of
Thank you.
troubles or really distressed, and the dispute, at least amongst fair-minded people, is how best to help these kids in an
That's right.
individual manner, and how there are great disagreements about how this is done.
Well, first off, thank you for all of that. I mean, your background is phenomenal. You really, to me, you're an actual real journalist. And we don't have, no, I'm not kidding. I read all your stuff. You're very fair. You do your research. You're not just flinging stuff at the wall. You're not, and the fact that they always have to come at people, you're a conservative. First off, what if I am? Secondly, why don't you read the article before you just label me into this space? So anybody who's watching this, if you're not familiar with Ben's writing, please, I put all his stuff in the description of this live, and really follow him and support his work, because I do believe you are helping us to get to, you don't have an agenda. That's, I think, really what I want to say is I
do, which is whatever the truth is.
Well,
so
you're right.
The truth, we saw this in COVID, like the truth per se, or our understanding of facts may evolve, so in the future, perhaps fantastic studies will show that if you do it just this way, these kids give these drugs, it turns out really well. Like, great, let's explore that. So at this time, that level of certainty is not at our fingertips by any means.
No. And also the fact, look, I did this, as you know, many, many years ago as an adult, and I don't believe that there's a thing of trans kids, because if it was, we would have been talking about it a long time ago, and we were not. And they have done studies, and I am a factual based person. It does work for adults. You can't deny that people like me exist. That being said, I truly do not believe I could have made this choice as a child. And I live this space, and I tell you, I wouldn't have wanted to be a trans child, because there's too many negatives as opposed to positives. Does that make sense?
Well, when you say there's no such thing as a trans child, like, what do you mean exactly? I mean,
I will.
You were a young person once. Was there not a trans person within you? Like, how do you define that?
No.
How do you delineate?
Great question. And how I delineate that was, how would I even understand that if I first off didn't go through puberty? How would I understand I want to be a boy, or when I don't even know what I am at 10 years old, not even going through puberty? Number one. Number two, the reason I don't say there's trans kids is because I do not consider myself trans. I consider myself a transsexual, who as a person who has a mental disorder, I don't transition to be trans. I transition to be a man. And so I don't like that label trans, because it's an identity. And I don't believe kids who have gender dysphoria, there are kids who have gender dysphoria. If we labeled it that way, I would say, yes, there are children who have a dysphoric space, gender dysphoric space, but we have to stop calling it trans. We need to say they have a mental disorder. I have a mental disorder. I have no issues with that at all. I think it's important that I understand that I have a mental disorder. It's like having autism or having whatever you have, right? And you know, oh, that's why I've been acting this way. It helps me move. When you got diagnosed with cancer and you weren't feeling well, and you got the diagnosis, you were like, oh, that's why I have this. Does that make sense?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, you and I have discussed this before, because I mean, I'd asked you, like, what is the difference in your mind between a transsexual and transgender person? And so, that makes sense. You're essentially sort of mitigating the suffering by affecting being a man the best you can.
And also, this is like a last effort, if that makes sense. You can't just lay medication on a kid immediately because you think they're trans. It takes a long time to understand this. And also, we should be helping kids sort of grow out of the dysphoria. We're helping kids grow into dysphoria. This was my last ditch effort after everything else I did. And this is why I lasted 32 years. And I'm growing as a person this way, because I didn't just get stamped with puberty blockers and surgery. You cannot, I don't care what anybody says, you cannot do that to a 13-year-old child. They are not prepared to take on what I have to take on daily. This isn't easy. I know I might make it look easy, but it's not. I have to live in this all, I'm not a man, right? So you have to get that around your head when you're transsexual. I'm never a man. I'll never be a man.
Yeah. I guess the problem is, and what you run up against is that puberty is coming. And if you go through the quote unquote wrong puberty for somebody who's, has gender dysphoria, identifies as transgender as a child, then they're stuck with that. They'll have to have more surgeries later, or
that's right.
It would be very difficult. I do have a little diminutive nose, but I have big hands and I'm tall and I have big shoulders and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So it would be difficult for me to pass as a woman. I guess one of the things I wonder about that is this emphasis on passing is if we're
Yes.
supposedly living in a society, especially younger people, who are more open to all different kinds of body types and ways of expressing gender, then
Sure.
is passing as important? I don't have the answer to these questions, but it's
For some it
a
is, and
response to that.
right,
Yeah.
for some it is. So I want to say this because that's a great point, right? Passing is very important to me. I make an effort. This isn't a privilege. It is a lot of work to get to where I have come to. That being said, if you notice, what is the percentage of young people that are transitioning? Girls. Girls. It's like a 4,000% increase of girls. They want to give puberty blockers to girls. I didn't take puberty blockers. Okay. Look at me. Nobody would ever know that I used to be living as a woman, right? That being said, if I understand, I had this conversation with Brianna Wu, and me and her disagreed because she's a trans woman. She was a boy, and now she had to deal with all of. So you have to understand it's different for a trans girl, right? A girl becoming a boy than it is for a boy becoming a girl. Yet the majority of kids that are being given puberty blockers and are transitioning are girls.
Yeah.
That's why we need to pull back on this, because there's something going on with girls. And so maybe there is that young boy who might benefit. But on that point, friend, I have interviewed, I think, 3 detransitioners who they were boys who became girls who took puberty blockers, who said they wish they'd never done it. They wish they'd never done it. They wish they could have just grown up and probably been gay men.
And it's really hard to know because we lack the long-term data, the follow-up data, to really determine, what proportion of people who receive this as minors will ultimately regret it. But also an unanswerable question of what would have happened if you hadn't done it at all. Might they not have grown out of it, or they continued to suffer, and it was just been a terrible waste of time delaying it. We can't answer these questions, but the Olson study. So Christina Olson, not to be confused with Joanna Olson Kennedy. Christina Olson is a psychologist at Princeton, and so she's had this long-running study that recruited very young kids between 2013 and 2014, and they're a really interesting subset because their families are really supportive. They tend to be white, affluent. And the average age of social transition was about 6 years old. So so these kids are now in adolescence. It's been quite a while that they've been followed, and they've done a pretty good job of keeping in touch with these kids and their parents over time. So the latest paper showed that the overwhelming majority of them, something like 97%, that had started blockers, hormones, or both, were still on them, were satisfied. So the question is, okay, how will they be 10 years from now? You guys didn't ask anything about sexual function. And these are teenagers. They aren't necessarily having sex, but they may be thinking, exploring, masturbating. No questions about that. So, and
that's
we're
dangerous.
Not about the fertility questions.
Well, that's another great point. And the point that these detransitioners made, they were given puberty blockers at 13 or 10. They have never, ever had sex. Okay. They've never felt sexual. They never feel that actually freaks me out. Sex is a huge part of being a human being. It's also about exploring your sexuality, exploring all kinds of space. So the fact that they're not even talking about that particular, making sexless like kids, you can't. I swear, you can see how I get so mad about that, because sex is very important. Masturbation, all of those things, and then what about all these girls that are going to lose their chance to reproduce? Right? They're not going to be able to have babies. And then what if they change their mind? Like what's her name?
Prisha just had a baby. Yeah.
That's, thank God.
Well,
they thought she couldn't do it.
I don't know if she said this in your show. So Prisha Mosley, who I referred to a moment ago, a detransitioner in North Carolina. She's a young woman. I think she's in her early 20s at this point.
Yeah.
So she had top surgery, double mastectomy in adolescence. That's part of her lawsuit. So she recently had a baby, and she said, I'm not betraying confidence, she said this in public, that she still has some sort of milk ducts, I guess, but there's no way for it to get out.
That's right.
And she said this is extremely painful. She's lactating. So that's it never would have occurred to me that could have been an impact of having.
I mean, the fact, I was the very first person to interview her. I remember she reached out to me and she was like, nobody will listen to me. The whole community, I use that in very loose terms. Just, how they do that when you detransition, you're a traitor and you're this, and they just stop. I mean, she was in despair and really not feeling good about herself. And she really went on to do amazing things and to really just become so great and an advocate for not letting this happen to young people. We need to listen to the detransitioners. They're the ones who actually who've been sucked up into this. Me, it worked out for me. I can only look at it as an elder in the community that it worked out for me as a 30-year-old female who made that choice after living as a gay woman for many years of my life and being a tomboy. And I tell people all the time, I did not have a bad childhood, Ben. I had an awesome childhood. My parents let me be little Buck, and I was that sports kid, and all of those things that I think a lot of these young girls are going to miss out on because we're, as adults in the medical world, assuming without hard evidence that this is going to create a better space for them when there's no evidence, none.
I do think it's important to acknowledge that these detransitioner cases, we don't know how common they are. They do take up a lot of oxygen in the discussion. But it's important. This is an interesting test, and very few people have been willing to answer this question. But if you say to them, okay, let's just say that putting kids on puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones puts them at high risk of infertility and sexual dysfunction, and then ultimately potential regret if they detransition. What percentage are you comfortable with between 0 and 99.9 of people ultimately having regret-based, and there are different types of detransitioning. People do it for different reasons, but truly regretful detransitioning. And I had someone say, as long as it's not the majority, said, okay, so you're fine if, out of 1,499 people regret it. And he said, yes. So that was very instructive about where this person's moral calculus is. So.
Well, I just feel this. So yes, that's the thing. For me, it's just kids. I don't care what adults do with their lives. I don't care how you have nose jobs and boob jobs and people get their butts this big and do all kinds of crazy stuff because that's
every episode of Botched.
Totally. I love that show. But that being said, I really believe we as adults have to really understand that these kids are not prepared to take this on. And people like myself should be heard at a higher level. I get shut down. But I actually have lived experience with this. If I really thought kids were suffering, I would be all for it. And I would be like, yeah, but I don't believe these kids are suffering. You know why? Because first off, I was a kid. And secondly, where did these kids just come out of nowhere? Why weren't they around when I was a kid? And why weren't they around? And I never saw kids suffering. Kids are not offing themselves. And all of this, idea that kids are going to, do this and do that, that's just not true. Kids in all kinds of aspects of life feel not good about themselves, right? It's not just trans kids or gay kids, or all kids have. I have a kid. I'm a parent. I have a 12-year-old. I'm a soccer coach. I'm around these kids. I don't see that. What they're trying to show on the internet, right? That there's all these kids that are just, no, that's just not true. You've got to let kids first off go through. I mean, I don't know how you were as a young gay boy. Did you suffer? Did you feel?
Yeah. I mean, I always say, so I was born in 78. So, really starting to come of age in the height of the AIDS epidemic, that era. And I always say this is not hyperbole at all, that there was a mass society-wide conspiracy to keep secret from me what gay was. And they were extremely successful. I did not find out what homosexuality was until I was almost 12 years old. I was late in the 5th grade. And then I don't not recall how I heard about it, but I remember the movie Clue, because Mr. Green is like, and I'm homosexual. And I asked my brother, what that was, and he wouldn't tell me. So that was the only time it came up that I might have found out. They told me what sex was when I was 4 years old, but they didn't mention that other part.
Interesting.
But I remember 2 weeks later after I found out what gay was, being like, oh my God, so because, looking back, I remember having a homoerotic dream when I was 4 years old. About the Incredible Hulk. Suddenly regret saying that on live stream.
But we know what your fantasies.
Somehow somebody let me watch that show with Lou Ferrigno. Middle school was hard. Faggot was thrown around, but it was like a generic insult. I was, but not everybody got called that. But if they would call it to me, I would think to myself, I didn't know that people registered as gay. No one really knew that I knew of. So I was perplexed as how in the world they might know since I hadn't told anyone. But Pedro Zamora was on The Real World when I think it was in the 8th or 9th grade. Yeah. And My So-Called Life came out when I was a sophomore. So the character of Ricky, played by, I'm looking at his name, I met him once.
Oh, yes.
He's an emissary for GLAAD.
Oh, my God.
Wilson Cruz. I didn't really relate to the character per se. He was kind of like a femmy boy, wore eye makeup, that kind of thing. But the fact that he was kind of incidentally gay. I mean, there was like a very special episode where, you know, you found out that his home life was awful, but it was more just like he was one of the girls and they just palled around and like everything was fine. And that was exactly what's happening in my life. I had kind of joined this pretty girl clique. Like literally it was just me and the girls.
Yeah.
And we had a lot of fun. And that I had kept that side of me hidden. My you know, the 80s, parents really wanted to police gender. They didn't want me to have female friends after kindergarten. I got one friend grandfathered in, we're still close. But I was just like, screw that when I was 16 and just joined the girl clique and had a ball and everybody was fine with it. And then I came out the end of my junior year and I always say, you know, I told a couple people before that school year ended, but I told everyone at like the party after the seniors graduated. Then everybody's like, we're not surprised in the slightest, you know, as a theater kid, you know. And so I was kind of gearing up to come back to school and it'd be a big scandal and everyone's kind of all up in arms or something. And the first day of senior year, like nobody said anything. It came up and like it was a very small private school, K through 12. So 48 kids in my class, and not everyone had even heard. And I'm like, you're telling me this wasn't even like interesting enough for you to pick up the phone and gossip? But I very much preferred coming out that way in the end. If the school had felt the need to sort of hose down every, you know, window with stickers and you know, pride flags everywhere, that's not to say that sort of signaling isn't helpful. And there are a lot of communities where kids still really need this of all kinds. But for me, it would have been really embarrassing. So,
but we don't need to push it. I mean, I totally get it. Believe that we always had. There's the LGBT clubs. That's why we have clubs.
Yeah.
But I do feel that they're pushing and more of a trans thing. They're not really talking about gay. They're they're talking about queer and trans, but they don't talk about the LGB part of that whole thing.
It's like, are gay guys? Are y'all fine? I don't know how to firsthand. I certainly see lots of data that, you know, sexual and gender minorities, you know, have worse mental health of all kinds. And so it's still hard out there. You know, I grew up in liberal Seattle, so I can't relate to what in the world it's like to grow up, you know, somewhere in rural East Kentucky or something like that. So I cannot comment on that whatsoever. So
of course not. But that being said, I think homosexuality is on some level, you know, I hate to use the word normalized, but it is. I don't think people on any level. So I'm wondering. I want to ask this question to you. Do you think there is sort of maybe possibly, I mean, it sounds so conspiracy, that there possibly is a sort of war on homosexual young people or kids, why they want to push this transing stuff?
It's hard to say. I couldn't very well put it that way myself with any substantive, you know, weight. But, you know, the debate is whether with, let's just say, biological boys in particular, if they are feeling gender nonconformity and they register that as a trans identity, as opposed to the fact that there are many gay men, not all, who tend to be somewhat gender nonconforming. They like hanging out with girls and, you know, they wouldn't mind, you know, putting on makeup with their little girlfriends and playing with Barbies. You know, that certainly was my own phenotype. But again, it was the 80s. It was strictly forbidden. I never told a soul that I was interested in My Little Ponies and that kind of thing. Right. So the question is, like, kids who grew up, you know, had the mindset similar to myself, if those boys are being misdirected into a trans identity, and, you know, there's no, like, in my mind, objective harm to that, you know, but the question is, if you get medicine involved and there are irreversible changes, then is that indeed transing away a gay identity? You know, there's some data like from the GIDS clinic in England. So that was the Gender Identity Development Service, or GIDS. It was the ultimately collapsed pediatric gender clinic in the National Health Service in England. So there was data there that showed that I think the majority of the kids that were coming in there were same-sex attracted. And if you haven't had a puberty yet and you haven't had the sexual awakening, you know, prepubescent kids do have a sexuality, but it certainly gets turbocharged when you have hormones rushing, when you're going through puberty. If you don't go through that, it may indeed make it more difficult to come to understand your own sexuality. And
that's right.
Ultimately channel it then into a sense of being transgender as opposed to being gay. And you know, people really scoff at this notion that, wait, are you out of your mind? This claim that in some worlds it's preferable or cooler in kids to be trans rather than to be gay. And that sounds outrageous given anyone who's lived for the past few decades. But, you know, there are certainly credible reports that in some communities of
Mhm.
young people that is absolutely true. And you hear from like
Yes.
Ben Appel, who's got this book coming out.
Mhm.
So I went to Columbia undergrad in 1997,
Mhm.
2001, and he went to what's called the School of General Studies, which is kind of for non-traditional students who maybe they were a ballet dancer or they had delayed getting into college for some reason. They're a little older.
Mhm.
They also are essentially Columbia undergrads. So he went to that school. I don't know exactly when he graduated, but a few years ago, and described this experience as just a white gay man like I was,
Mhm.
and how stigmatized he was by
Wow.
his peers, and they would look down on him for
Yeah,
not being queer, gender queer, all these other things to do with gender identity.
that's
So,
right.
and he's written a lot about that. That is very surprising to me. I basically was gay there. I had a mild pseudo gay bashing experience my first week there. There were some wrestlers from Oklahoma or something, and they
Wow.
came to my door to see at the dorm to sort of goonishly look at a live one, just stared at
A
me, and
live one.
I knew exactly what they were doing instantly. I took one look in their face,
Oh,
and
wow.
what they did not know is the deans are all gay, and they got a river of trouble. And that was a bad way to start because I'd had no homophobia since the 8th grade. My high
Wow.
school was fine, but my experience was just sort of like, you're gay, and it was like whatever. It wasn't really
Yeah.
mentioned that much.
Yeah.
And I was never wanted gay to be like the leading factor of my personality that sort of leads when I walk in the room. I've written a lot about LGBTQ things in my career, but it was never my intent to sort of have that be the forefront of my sort of public identity, if you will. Which is not to say that most of my friends are gay. I live in a very gay neighborhood, so
Sure.
but it's a balance of that,
Well,
So
that's because you're that's healthy. That's what I'm trying to say
maybe,
also about it is you're gay. So what? Okay, but you're also Ben, you're also a
yeah,
journalist. That's what I'm trying to
right.
say to these young kids. I believe that trans is an identity choice now. It
Hmm.
is not
Hmm.
what I have, which is an
Hmm.
actual diagnosis of gender dysphoria. Some of these kids might most definitely have
Hmm.
dysphoria, but they're just self-IDing as trans, becoming trans to be part of me and you both come. Everybody's been in a group in school, right? Like the jocks or the punks or the whatever,
Me and a
you
bunch
know,
of pretty
are
girls.
yeah, the pretty girls. I see trans
Yeah.
as a means and a way to
Hmm.
identify into a group because you want to be liked. Like all kids want to be part of the hot, awesome group. And that to me is different when it's maybe you're a cheerleader or hot girls or whatever than saying you're trans, which that's why they decided to say trans is not a mental disorder. And I 100% disagree with
Hmm.
that. I believe it is. It's not, this is not normal. It's not bad, but it's not, I don't want to normalize somebody wanting to be the opposite sex because there's something that I wished I could just stay a woman. I really wished I could have. I really tried very hard to do that. It
Hmm.
didn't work out for me. I feel much happier living in this body, but I went through a lot of process to understand I'm not going to change my sex. I'm never going to be like Ben. I'm never going to have a working penis. I'm not going to have all the things that I wished I was born with.
Hmm.
And to have that understanding, you sort of also have to have some lived experience as you do, but we also need to separate sexuality from gender, right? Like homosexuality is not the same as transgenderism. They're two completely opposite things. If that makes sense, you can try on homosexuality and decide maybe I'm not and maybe I'm just this, but to try on transsexualism and
Well,
then
involving medical interventions.
that's right. That's
That's
why I'm
different
saying
than just
they have
growing your hair, wearing a dress and makeup. That's one
totally
thing.
different.
But
Why we need to say it's okay to be gender nonconforming. It's okay to be that. That's why I don't have any issues with non-binary people. I just have an issue with them putting themselves in a trans space. It's gender nonconforming. That's been around. I mean, pretty much since the beginning of time, as far as I'm concerned.
So I guess I wanted to talk about my recent reporting for the New York Sun about Boston
Yes,
Children's Hospital.
great.
So this, as some backstory, there's a big debate
Yeah.
over whether the quote unquote Republican talking points or other critics, what they say is true, that all these kids are being rushed.
Yes.
If they're just being whisked through this process right under puberty blockers without
Okay.
any real question. We do know that that's the basis of most of these lawsuits, but this is 2 dozen children and young adults who had this experience, so maybe that's not representative. It's very hard to get solid data on this field. It tends to be very insular, very secretive, and as we know, they're not really gathering data very well.
Right.
In Ohio, in particular, the governor, Republican Mike DeWine, he vetoed the bill that was trying to ban gender transition treatment for children at the end of last year. And he tried to sort of offer these concessions in hopes that they wouldn't counter veto it, which they ultimately did. And one of them was, he said, wanted to put in these various regulations, and one of them was a requirement to gather data. He's saying we need data on these kids, and he was, was very right that there is a real lack of that. So it leaves this black box to understand a lot of the practices, how kids are doing, and indeed, like, what are the procedures? We know that WPATH, the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, which is a quasi-activist and medical organization, which is essentially appointed itself as the world leaders in this field. I mean, you have to create medical societies out of somewhere. So, the AMA was once a nascent group too.
Okay.
So, I don't know who officially designates that you are an official medical group, but in any case, in their standards of care, as they call them, in the capital S, capital C, eighth edition that came out in the fall of 2022, they said there has to be a comprehensive biopsychosocial assessment. The previous version said that too.
Yes.
Before adolescents are put on puberty blockers, etc. They're not very specific about that. They don't say how long it should be, so it really leaves that up to interpretation. But these lawsuits in general all say that, one, they consider that to be a low bar and that you didn't even meet it. So that's a general basis of a medical malpractice suit, is to say, whatever the standard of care, little s, little c, in whatever field you're talking about, did you meet that? Would any reasonable surgeon also have done that?
Right.
That thing that led to this poor outcome for this plaintiff. So the lawsuit at Boston Children's, it was a civil lawsuit involving a former psychologist named Amy Tishelman, and she was hired. She had been at Boston Children's for about 20 years at the time, in 2013, to be the research director at GEMS, which is, I forget what it stands for, but GEMS is the pediatric gender clinic at Boston Children's. It was the first in the nation to establish a pediatric gender clinic. They imported at least a version of the so-called Dutch protocol from the Netherlands. The Netherlands researchers are the people who first established the protocol for prescribing puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones to gender dysphoric children. So Dr. Tishelman worked at the gender clinic in 2013 and told me she was fired in 2021. And I would be remiss if I didn't say that she won her lawsuit for retaliation. They fired her over a claim that she had violated HIPAA, which is the federal privacy law that protects medical records. Her lawyer said that there was sort of trumped up charges. Ultimately, it sounds like the jury agreed. But she also sued them for gender and age-based discrimination. I listened to a lot of the trial. I didn't think she ever provided any concrete evidence for those two counts. I didn't hear the end of the trial, but I knew ultimately she did win. But the point of this is that within this, out came all this information about the practices at GEMS, at Boston Children's Pediatric Gender Clinic. Yes. And we learned, according to Dr. Tishelman, and also Laura Edwards-Leeper, who helped found this clinic in 2007, has corroborated this with me in an independent interview, that the general policy was to provide for psychosocial assessments for gender dysphoric children coming into GEMS. It was a 20-hour process. Now, that included the psychologist spending maybe about 10 hours with the kid in different visits, and also potentially speaking with outside sources with permission, such as a school counselor or independent therapist, talking with the family, having them fill out all these forms, and grading them and scoring them, different mental issues, and writing a very long report. Ultimately, somewhere along the way, that got down to 10 hours. And then by 2016, according to the testimony of a psychologist named Carrie McGregor, who's also been at GEMS for a long time, is now an administrator there as well, it got cut down to 4 hours. And this is the whole process, including writing the report. And finally, in 2018, they cut it down to a 1 2-hour appointment. There's 1 hour with the kid, and then there's another hour. It was unclear if it was either just with the parents or with the parents and the kid. And then there's 30 minutes to write an assessment. And Dr. McGregor said that she writes those assessments, that report, it takes her about 15 to 45 minutes. She uses the template. I told this, she was absolutely shocked. She said, 15 minutes?
What?
And, so you get these outside, and you hear the tone of voice of these people in court, and they're describing it in a very matter of fact, and their own lawyers are drawing this out of them, this information, which is very damning. And so I think it speaks to how insular this world is of pediatric gender medicine. They don't allow in a lot of outside voices to WPATH. Nope. There's no way I could ever get into the WPATH conference. Yep. They don't talk to the press that much. Nope. So I think they're very surprised when an average person hears that, and you're like, so this kid's 9 to 12 years old, shocked him once, and then you approved him to go to endocrinology, potentially get puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones.
Wow.
And the language that one of the attorney used was hormone readiness assessments. One of the questions, so these hormone readiness. So we're not just, you could say, oh, well, they're just talking about puberty blockers, and then they're going to think about it more until they get the hormones.
That's right.
When asked about a hormone readiness assessment, those words, I forget which one of the people from Boston Children's who it was, they confirmed, yes, 2 hours. So that's been their policy for almost 7 years. And nobody's known this till now. This is the most prestigious overall children's hospital in the country. Their gender clinic was the first of its kind in the nation, and is, among the preeminent gender clinics, along with Lurie Children's, UCSF, and Children's Hospital Los Angeles in the country. And this has been kept secret from the public amid all this debate. And
but
all
why?
These trials, these kids.
Why? Why was it kept secret? That's what really. Yeah.
One would imagine that that at least deep down they know that the public will find this to be, unfortunate. And you hear the way we've seen WPATH, the way they talk in private. So the Alabama Attorney General, for their federal court case over their ban of pediatric gender medicine, they have a very aggressive Attorney General, subpoenaed all these records from WPATH, and those started to get unsealed in June. And we hear the way that WPATH talked with Johns Hopkins, who they commissioned to conduct all these systematic literature reviews, which is the gold standard of scientific evidence about gender transition treatment from all different angles, including with kids and adults. And we hear that when they started to realize that the results were not to their liking, they started to pressure them and to suppress the information and to say, we can't have the results be anything that would be counter to our advocacy goals, which is essentially to say that, like, this is a wide open process and there should be, no one should infringe upon our rights to do whatever we want. And this is a big question, is, does the government, at least in this case, have a right to step in and say, if this medical field is not regulating itself, it is doing an egregious job of policing itself, does the government have a right to preempt due process and the right of parents to decide on behalf of their children the medical decisions, and to say that we're stepping in? Sorry. And so that's a big legal question.
Well, I'm going to tell you that I believe that there has to be some regulation. You can't just go doing stuff like that without. Don't we have regulations in this country for pretty much everything that's in that space? Medical stuff would go haywire if we didn't have any oversight. And if they're not oversighting themselves in a way that we should all be able to see it. Look, I've been part of WPATH, has been around forever, by the way. I think it started in like the 70s.
I remember the Harry Benjamin Society.
That's right. It's been around forever.
And we started in 1978.
They've always policed themselves, right? They always were very insular, very policed themselves. But what happened was it grew to be this sort of dominant, we're the kings, we know, we're self-appointing, as opposed to, I really feel like they lost their way. But I want to go back to that because you're so amazing. First off, Ben, thank you so much for being here. You're incredible. The information you're giving all of us will be sitting here forever, and people can actually see factual information. So now they're not getting oversight. And I mean, my mind is blown that this was all going on, and they're not showing, they didn't want to release the information, right? Because they knew if they released the information, it wasn't going to be what they wanted people to see.
And then, Admiral Levine, the Assistant Secretary for Health and HHS, transgender women, it's all on paper, it's all in the emails, pressured WPATH in 2002 as they were leading to the publication of the Standards of Care 8 to remove the age limits for especially surgery she was concerned with, but also for any puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones for any child. And this was explicitly for political reasons. It's right there in black and white in these emails. And then the American Academy of Pediatrics ultimately threatened WPATH, said not only will we not endorse this, but we'll come out against it. And so at the 11th hour, after the document was published, they took it down. I think it was the same day, and then republished it, taking out the age limits. And then Marcy Bowers, who I think is no longer, but at the time was the president of WPATH. She's a very successful leading gender affirming surgeon out of California. She says right there in the emails how we can coordinate our cover story. That's not the word she used, but that they colluded to lie about having done that. What's a good excuse? It's right there
Wow.
in black and white. And so, it really begs to question, you look at Alzheimer's research, for example, there are plenty of areas of medicine and medical research that have been shown to be rather dishonest. But it really makes you wonder, again, like, if you have such a strong case for medicalizing these transitions,
Yes,
wouldn't you be more transparent?
that's
Why does
right.
this have to come out through subpoenas, through lawsuits? And it's only going to make you look worse in the end. So Erica Anderson was another trans woman.
She's
She's
a
the head of
friend.
US Path.
Yes.
She's a psychologist, and US Path is the US edition of WPATH, which is weird because WPATH is essentially a US organization. It's not
Yeah.
really a world organization that's based here. Almost all their leadership comes out of the US. But in any case, she quite notoriously gave this interview to Abigail Schreier, the author of Bad Therapy and of Irreversible Damage, who was a year ahead of me at Columbia. In fact, we don't remember. I asked her, like, "Do you remember me?" And she's like, "No, I never left the library." I'm like, "Me neither. I just studied. I was just learning."
Awesome.
So we're both very bookish people. Although she had two books out of her, I have no books. But in any case, so now I forget what I was going to say. Oh yeah, so she told Abigail Schreier that there were many instances of "quote unquote" sloppy care in this field. And that was published, and that caused this paroxysm inside of WPATH, US Path. Everyone's furious and she's told me about this, and she was, at odds with Maddie Deutsch, who's this leading figure in the field out of UCSF. And I can't remember if it was US Path or WPATH in general that said this, but they wanted to put a moratorium on their members talking to the press. And Erica was adamant, this is the worst idea. This will only come back to haunt us. But they didn't listen. And I'm fairly sure that moratorium was fairly well in place. And it has only come back to haunt them because it looks a lot worse. It's kind of like when you're a kid and like, if you find out you were lying, and I'm not saying you're lying, but it's that tension where they warn you, like,
Totally.
You'll be in worse trouble if you confess that you stole the cookie now. And again, I'm not saying they stole a cookie or anything like that. But
yeah, I know.
That idea of it looks worse.
It is worse.
if it didn't come out through your own admission.
That's right.
So
that's right.
Yes. So I guess we're going to play.
Yes.
So Michael Hobbs is a debunking podcaster. If you haven't heard of him,
he's a what?
He's a debunking podcaster.
Okay.
So he is very successful. I have heard. I won't say the figure, but I have heard talk in Seattle, where I'm from and where he lives.
Okay.
That he makes a lot of money off of podcasting. And so he used to be the host of You're Wrong About. He's the host of Maintenance Phase, which likes to take shots at the diet industry and other fads. And this other podcast called If Books Could Kill, which takes shots at like the type of books self-help books that you buy in the airport.
Oh, right.
So Michael's basic shtick is he looks into something and then he tells everyone why this expert who published this book is wrong about their field or study. And look, I do this too. So that's a big part of my work, is trying to find out if people are being dishonest. So the question is, like, is Michael correct? And the most famous example that I can provide to you is, so Matthew Shepard, as we all know, was murdered in 1998, tied to a fence post. Extreme tragedy. It was a huge watershed moment in gay rights. I myself was in the front lines of the Matthew Shepard riot, I call it, in New York City, Manhattan. We stormed through Manhattan. We stopped traffic on 5th and 5th Avenue. Everybody was arrested. There's a big picture of me like this, in the Daily News. So I believed in this wholeheartedly, that he wasn't indeed a martyr killed because he was gay. So Stephen Jimenez is a journalist, and he wrote this book called The Book of Matt.
Excellent book.
In 2013, I believe. He spent years on it, and I've read it. It's very convincing, and it essentially says that, for all we can tell, Matt was not killed because he was gay. He was deeply entwined with the meth trade between, it was Denver, Grand Junction, and Laramie, where he lived. And that ultimately this was a meth situation gone bad, involving a guy tweaking and all this stuff. One of them, I can't remember, it was Russell or the other guy, was, one of them was sort of sucked into it between the two men, who were responsible for his death. Book's very convincing, you never know. But so it was 6 years ago now, on the You're Wrong About pod. So Michael Hobbs puts out this podcast where it was a debunking of the debunking. And he said that the claim that Matthew Shepard was not killed because he was gay is wrong. So the person that they got to explain this was a guy who had once written a paper in grad school about this subject. some years ago, and he was like
Okay.
from there. And this was like an hour and 20-minute podcast, and none of them had read the book. No, some of them had seen that 2020 interview that was done some years before, but they were literally debunking a book that
they never read.
All said quite openly that they had not read.
Wow.
And I did this long tweet thread about this because I was like walking around the summer. I'm like, this is unbelievable. And I was kind of live streaming my shock at the sheer dishonesty. Like, but it's actually, they were being very honest about how they didn't know what they were doing.
Wow.
And I've met Michael once, and we had coffee once some years ago, because he had written this amazing article for the Huffington Post about gay loneliness. And it really, I really appreciate it. It was 2017 because I always say that, at least historically, the gay press has been about two things. Isn't gay hot, and aren't straight people mean? It's very Manichaean, good guys, bad guys, we're the victims, and we're also really hot. These days it's different. It's sort of like, isn't queer fabulous, and aren't fat people mean or something? I don't know. But lost train of thought. But so going into Michael Hobbs. So
let me bring this guy up.
I listened to it this summer. It was almost 3 hours of him ranting about the CAS review, which is this enormous review of pediatric gender medicine out of England, and how wrong it was, and all this sort of thing. Okay. So his main thesis is that everyone's saying that kids are being rushed into gender transition treatment, and there's a quote in the third video in the thread of him saying, you need to have kids, and you need to have rushing, and no one has that. And so as you can see, I made this thread where I did some videos where I show what he said, and then I show what all the people from Boston Children's said.
Brilliant.
If you want to go to my Twitter, people, it's Ben Ryan Writer on X, and it's my pinned tweet. So you can scroll through it yourself and watch all these videos.
But I want to bring this one video.
Yeah,
you want to play
one of him, because you can really hear how my mother had this expression, which was often wrong but never in doubt. And, so go back up.
Is it this one? Yeah. This one, wait, here's the first one. Wait, here's the first one.
It was that one you just pointed to.
So
scroll down.
2, 3. Not that
this
one.
This one. So let's listen to that one.
Let's listen.
Here.
Okay, here we go.
If you're talking about a real social problem, you should be able to point to instances of it that everyone agrees are examples, right? So if I say that like school shootings are a problem in America, if I talk about Uvalde, Texas, the most hardcore far-right gun nut will be like, yep, that's a school shooting. If we're going to talk about kids being rushed into transition, it's like, sorry, your examples need to have kids and they need to have rushing. It's really fucking suspicious that you cannot provide straightforward examples of your own claims. That is not what we see from like real movements that are seeking to, safeguard women or like whatever they say they're trying to do, protect children. That's something we see from anti-vaxxers.
Wait,
if you're talking about it,
we are seeing examples.
Well, so scroll up now and go to the second video in the thread, and we'll hear from Dr. Tischerman what she said in her trial.
Is this
Not
Dr.
Tischerman? That one, yeah.
This one right here?
Yes.
Is that her?
Click that one. We can just hear a first 20 seconds of it.
Some of the evaluations could take 10 to 20 hours. They're supposed to take 10 hours. When I started, there were 20 hours. And now they were asking me to do them in 2.5 hours.
It was Boston Children's.
And I didn't feel like that was doable at all.
Oh my God.
I feel was reckless and not okay to only get 2.5 hours to see patients who were considering these medications if they needed more.
Oh my God. Dude, the fact that I know these people are really making me so mad because he's an actual psychologist saying that.
One of the leaders in the field. She was the lead author of the prepubescent chapter of the Standards of Care 8 revision for WPATH in 2022. So her name is on, a lot of top papers in this field. What better can you get?
The guy, that bin dude, is actually completely full of it. This is the problem that I keep telling everybody. First off, if it really was solid and we had solid evidence that this worked for kids, we'd all be for it. Every single one of us here today would be totally for it. There's no doubt about it, but it's not true. Why are they hiding it? It's really blowing my mind that people don't want this information to be out there. What are they going to... What is going to come of lying about doing this to children, especially when actual professionals are telling you no?
Well, just to accept that, of course, Michael Hott's not himself in the pediatric gender field, but he's a very influential podcaster, and a lot of people hang on his every word. So
that's right.
He
That's
really
my point.
influences how people see this. And it's, as I said in the beginning of our discussion today, it takes an enormous amount of time to understand this subject well, because of how contradictory it is and how difficult it is to understand the science. And who has that kind of time?
Nobody.
So one of the things in last year, I was trying to write about this for left-leaning publications. Ultimately, I just gave up. Yeah. But initially, I was trying to write the story, and I started on it for one publication, and then they killed it, which is the word in journalism when they end your story, it doesn't get published. Mm-hmm. So I spent a couple of weeks interviewing a bunch of pediatricians, and it was sort of a biased sample in the sense that, like, I had the skeptics, and only one or two people were kind of in a snowballing effect finding sources for me. So I wasn't exactly getting an exact representative sample. I had the skeptics, and then I had the other pediatricians, who were just sort of every day, and where they weren't particularly obsessed with this particular topic. And there was a stark difference between them. The skeptics, they had all done the reading, they'd all done the homework, they had read up on this thoroughly, and everyone else said, well, I trust the AAP, the American Academy of Pediatrics, and this isn't my specialty, so I refer them to the gender clinic because they know what they're doing. And that's what the AAP is for. They're there to do the homework for you, to show guidelines, so that you don't have to spend all day long, reading some encyclopedia before you prescribe an antibiotic to a child.
Yeah.
And one thing that I was really interesting that the skeptics said to me is they all had like a reason why they had time to do all the reading. They would say things like, well, I was single at the time, and during lockdown and COVID, I had extra time on my hands, so I started doing all this reading, or my husband takes care of the kids, or that kind of thing. So it really goes to show that, like, the average pediatrician in particular in this case doesn't have the time to become an expert in this subject. It's who really does. So I really empathize with the average person of like not being able to understand this very well, or if they hear something from GLAAD or HRC, these major LGBTQ organizations, and they just sort of take on faith that these people, they're the experts in the subject. Shouldn't we trust them? So
I know that's the scary GLAAD. I don't care how I cannot stand. GLAAD is completely captured. They're you write the best articles. You actually outed who's the lady who runs that space and how much.
That was not me. So the New York Times did this enormous expose about Sarah Kate Ellis.
Yes,
is the CEO of GLAAD, has been for some years now, and she really rescued their finances. They were in dire straits, and they've been raising a lot. Their money goes up and up every year. They raise a lot of money off the trans issue. And it turns out that she was using a lot of this money that she was, flying first class to all these places, staying in these fancy hotels. They had paid to renovate her office. They had, subsidized her vacation home in Provincetown and all these things. So it's sort of the question of like, which was amazing because GLAAD was throwing all this hate and claiming falsely, in my opinion, that the New York Times was, publishing anti-trans articles that like weren't following the science.
We're not.
I think that's absolutely false.
Totally.
And so they drove this truck around the New York Times. I don't know if it was driving or they parked it. Someone asked me to fact check this once. I'm like, is it parking or is it driving? I don't know. I only have a photo. I can tell if it's moving. There was a truck. It lights up on the side and had all these things that they were mad at the New York Times about. One of them said, the science is settled about pediatric gender medicine, which is an outrageously false claim about anything. You say that even gravity they had wrong in some way. I don't understand.
Yeah.
But especially about this field, like to overplay and like talk about like bluffing and poker. You're like, are you kidding me? Here we have. So here are a half dozen systematic literature reviews, which was the gold standard of scientific evidence that have all concluded that the evidence in this field is weak and uncertain. And I think a lot of the response to that will be, they'll say there are plenty of other instances in pediatrics in which low quality evidence, according to what that means in the evidence-based medicine field, is acceptable for prescribing medications, et cetera. And that's certainly true. So it's important to look at the nuances of it. So there are sort of different categories of, let's say someone has a dire fatal condition, they're going to die in 3 weeks, and you have something that might help them and there's no alternative and you don't have very good evidence of it. That's ethically justifiable. Like, we might as well just try it, or like the whole notion that you shouldn't give aspirin to children, you know, of a flu for fever reduction, you
Okay.
should give them Tylenol because of the risk of Ray's disease.
Mhm.
In that case, there is also low quality evidence to back this, that you shouldn't give them aspirin because there's an easy alternative. You just give them Tylenol.
That's
So
right.
that's another case. In this case, we've got a condition, gender dysphoria, which is claimed to be highly fatal, and that's absolutely not true. And I'll go
Not
into
true.
the details of that in a second. But so it's absent the treatment, they're not, you know, going to die in weeks. You know, this notion
That's
that they'll
right.
definitely kill themselves is false, and I'll
Mhm.
go into that in a second. So because the risks, the known risks, not even the unknown or theoretical risks, but the known risks are high with this type of treatment for children, and because the absence of it is not going to lead to a certain death, that combination of factors demands a higher level of evidence.
That's
You know, and we're
right.
talking about infertility, I'm talking about sexual function. So
Yep.
infertility, and in particular for natal males, you know, granted this needs to be studied more, but in theory, so Tanner 2 is the stage. It's called Tanner 2. There's 1 through
Mhm.
5. 5 is you're done with puberty. 1 is hasn't happened yet. 2 is
Mhm.
the very beginning. So if you start a natal male on puberty blockers and then go on to estrogen later at Tanner 2, they're going to maintain a micropenis, and their
Mhm.
testicles will not develop such that they can produce viable sperm. There's no real way. It's sort of maybe investigation at this point to try to get a sperm sample.
Mhm.
But essentially, this kid will remain prefertile permanently.
Mhm.
And Marcy Bowers, again, our friend from WPATH, said to a group of colleagues, you know, and there are 2 quotes. There's one, there's a video out there, and there's another one that was I think, I don't know where it said, but it's written down, and it was published recently by the Alabama Attorney General in
Mhm.
their amicus brief, the Supreme Court, about the case that's going up next term
Mhm.
about bans on pediatric gender medicine. So Marcy Bowers has said, you know, if you suppress puberty at a young age, that these kids, especially the natal males, you know, may never be able to have an orgasm. So,
Yeah.
and as we've discussed, you know, I can certainly test this in my own life. There is no way in hell you could have ever described to me in a way that would have registered me what an orgasm feels like until I'd had one. And I remember that was my first thought. I was like, oh, you know, like
Yeah.
never Basic Instinct was out in the time, and like you see all these sex thrillers, and you're like,
Yeah.
what's all this stuff about sex? And then you're like, oh my God, there's no way to explain this to a child. And she describes there was a natal male identified as trans female going into vaginoplasty, I think it's 17 or 18, you know, had no sexual function. She said that, you know, for them, touching their genitals is the same thing as touching their thigh in terms of the sensation. Not that she's touching their genitals, but like
I know.
if one
but
did. But that this child didn't know anything about orgasms. And her mother's
That's
like, oh,
right.
honey, didn't they teach you that in school? And the kid's like literally like about to be wheeled in to the operating room. So with that, so and also to discuss the idea of suicidality, there's, you know, there are a lot of research that show that trans kids in particular, kids who identify as trans, you know, have a high rate of suicidality. You know, the quality of that evidence, one can debate it, but
Yeah.
for years now, we've been told with increasing ferocity that this is life-saving care. That's what GLAD says,
That's
as
right.
HRC says,
Yep.
that if you don't give these drugs to kids, that they're going to kill themselves. And so a
Yep.
lot of these detransitioner lawsuits, medical malpractice lawsuits, use that as a linchpin where parents are told, they're on the fence and they're told, would you rather have a live son or a dead daughter, or the reverse, depending on the
Yeah.
gender
Right.
/ sex of the child?
Right.
And parents will cave at this. So
Yeah.
what they're implying very clearly is that absent this treatment, your kid will almost certainly kill themselves.
It's
So
not true.
let's look at the actual rates that we know of. There isn't much data. There's one, Michael Biggs, who's a sociologist in Oxford, did one analysis of the GIDS
Mhm.
clinic data. And I'm forgetting the exact numbers of what it was, but the suicide death rate was something like 5.5 times higher in the group of kids who went to the gender clinic compared with like the average for kids their age. And
Wow.
it was sort of similar. I think it was something like 3 times higher in this Finnish data. The Finns are great because they have national data on everybody from birth to
Mhm.
death. There's not much in or out migration, so it's a
Mhm.
great way to get comprehensive health data. So they did this big analysis they published in February, and they were the first and only study ever to actually directly analyze this question of like, is there a difference if kids who receive these treatments in their suicide death rate? Not just
Right.
suicidality or attempts or considerations,
Right.
etc., but actual life and death. They found that indeed the death rate was higher, but like it was something like 3.5 times higher. And but
Okay.
when they controlled for the use of specialist psychiatric appointments, and that's so specialist psychiatric appointments in Finland, this is for very serious mental illness, not just
Yes.
like depression, anxiety, I'm sad.
Yes.
But there's a certain special level in Finland that you have to get to in terms of
Okay.
your problems to get into that kind of care. If they controlled for that, there was no independent association with having gone to a gender clinic and a difference in the suicide death rate. So what they're
Interesting.
implying is, and people can sort of do a chicken or egg debate about this, is
Okay.
that it wasn't the fact that they were gender dysphoric that was directly associated with a higher rate of death. It was that gender dysphoric kids have a lot of mental health problems. And so then there's this
Yes.
question like, well, yes, of course, because the gender dysphoria caused the other mental health problems, or being
Yep.
transgender caused
Yep.
minority stress, as it's called, and that caused mental health problems. And then
Right.
the argument is like, no, the other argument is that the mental health problems are leading to a maladaptive coping mechanism, which is the trans identity, which is why it'd be a really bad idea to medicalize this, because you're really treating something very distant from the source and you're potentially harming them.
Great.
But in any case, they also did an analysis that asked if there was a difference in the death rate based on whether these young people had received gender transition treatment or not. And it was like adolescents and young adults. They didn't just do minors. And they found so that there was no independent, after they controlled for differences in psychiatric care,
Okay.
a statistically significant difference in the death rate between having received this type of treatment and not receiving it. There's been a lot of debate about these findings. And so if you know anything about stats, there's a p-value. A p-value of 0.01, is considered very statistically significant, and 0.05 is kind of like the baseline threshold. It means that in like 95% of cases, your finding would be what would happen in the real world, essentially.
Okay.
So if you use 0.05 as a cutoff, it is statistically significant. I think there was like a 3.5-fold difference in suicide death rate. But if you use 0.01, there isn't. And the authors argue that we have a very large sample, thousands of young people. Therefore, it justifies having a higher threshold. So you certainly heard from people from WPATH argue that that's not right. You should use 0.05. Even then, it was like 0.055. It was like right on the cusp.
Right.
And my response to that is like, the reason we're even having this debate is because the death outcomes were so rare that there is not a clear signal. And Marcy Bowers herself, when I talked to her once about this paper, the only time I ever spoke with her, after that she went right into the let's blacklist Ben Ryan camp. She said to me that suicide death has never been a good measure of the efficacy of these treatments. But she also in the same breath said to me that, gender transition surgeries are a panacea. She described that everyone she's seen, once they go through the process and they fully physically transition, that they're fine, they don't need therapy anymore. This is a surgeon talking, mind you, not a psychologist, but that's what she told me. I
disagree.
I happen to know that there's one patient of hers who would disagree. I won't say anything more than that. But
I'm sure there's a lot more who would disagree. Like I keep telling people, this is a mental disorder. The fact that they keep trying to take it out, that just once you change your thing, first off, this isn't the only part of the mental disorder. You have to go into the world. You have to function in the world. You have to understand you have to be solid in who you are. Just because you get medically transitioned, the dysphoria doesn't go away. My dysphoria has not gone away. I still have certain kinds of dysphoric spaces. And so that's why the whole thing is so much more complex than they're trying to make it seem. They're trying to put it in this really weird black and white space, if that makes sense, where if you do this is the outcome and everything's going to be okay. And that's just not true. And that's the history of transsexualism.
Well, any treatment that offers a panacea, you have to stop and wonder, and I myself have, been psychoanalyzed to death by an analyst.
Yeah.
And, a big part of that is the fallacy of looking to any one thing that's going to be the answer to your problems. You're going to get the house, you're going to get the perfect spouse, and
excellent,
have the perfect job and have the perfect body and all this money and have the perfect kids.
That's
right. And that might be the one thing that'll lead to happiness, but it is that very thought that is leading to your unhappiness, because it's an insatiable neurosis, especially as Americans wanting to be perfect. I myself am a hyper perfectionist, so I struggle with these things.
Yeah.
So that you have to ask if the bill of goods you're selling has been oversold, which is not to say at all that one should not sell it, but to have reasonable expectations.
Yes.
It's not going to be over, like as you're saying, like this is a lifelong condition. You're managing it through various means. And that could be true for people who have all sorts of conditions, whether they're physical,
That's right.
let's say you have lymphoma or something, or mental, you suffer from
Yes.
depression or anxiety. And this is how we deal with it. So, and I think that's a really interesting, and I've asked some other people about their sort of way of seeing sort of gender essentialism, and that indeed they say, some people will say, like, maybe they use the term transsexual, that like, I'm not a woman, but I've done everything I can to sort of manage it to affect being a woman, to deal with my ongoing problems. So, and I'm not saying any one way is wrong or right,
No.
but it's interesting to hear how people use different language to describe themselves, and that is a way of explaining of like how they deal with their place in the world. And I guess one thing I wanted to say earlier, talking about being a man, and like, I'm not going to be a man like you. It's like, I have plenty of ambivalence about being a man myself. Like, this is a joke, but like, there's a quote from Manhattan, the Woody Allen movie.
Yeah, love it.
Diane Keaton's character, who's this like really obnoxious intellectual, she says, "My problem is I'm both attracted to and repelled by the male organ." That kind of thing. Like, men's bodies are weird. Like, what is this? So, but for me personally, it's like, I being a woman wouldn't solve this problem. So, but that's not. Like,
that's right.
It's to say that like lots of people, even who don't identify as or aren't transgender, also are ambivalent about their sex or gender. There's a lot of pressure, at least in the generation I came up in. Again, like the height, I came out literally like right when protease inhibitors came out. So like, as I was about to come out, my whole life had been like AIDS crisis.
Yeah.
And everyone says that a big part of that was this pressure for gay men to look really muscular. That ultimately spilled out into popular culture with people like Calvin Klein ads and that kind of thing, to compensate for possibly being pegged as having wasting disease and having AIDS. So, I remember there was this kid I went to college with, and we'd like go out to bars in New York, and he would literally like say out loud, "I gotta butch it up, I gotta butch," because it was expected of you. And this, hasn't necessarily changed, like must be masked and all that stuff. That, amongst gay men in particular, there is a lot of pressure to be masculine, despite the fact that for a lot of us, our natural inclination is to be rather effeminate, and maybe we're not being as sincere. So, and I remember saying to my mother, I'd come out and we're sort of like openly discussing these issues, and at the time, no one ever discussed the idea of a transgender adolescent. That wasn't ever in the water, so to speak. But that at the time I sort of said that I saw myself as kind of like a different gender. I didn't continue this sort of thought, but I guess, I had two brothers and, dad. I didn't think of myself as male like they were. It was just something else,
Yeah, right.
So, but that's just sort of
which is healthy. I don't think there's anything, and that's the thing. People, why do you think plastic surgery is so big? It's not just relegated to trans people who want to change things. Like, we all want to be perfect or be those ways. We all have, I would say, on some level, probably all of us on some level have some form of gender or body dysphoria that's not happy with this part or that part.
The spot right below my belly button. The fact that people wear crop tops, and I'm like, that is the last part of my body I would ever show to you people and like display. Like, not right. I used to do ballet, and I was, I had to wear a tight white shirt, to class, and it would just listen. If you ever want to make yourself crazy, like stare at yourself in the mirror for 25 hours a week.
No, I know. Believe me.
Like,
I'm that guy. I'm the perfectionist too. It's like, no, I gotta look more like a man. I'm like, dude, you look like a dude. I'm like, no, I don't. You can just keep going into that deep hole, but I just want to say we're going to end here, and it's been such a pleasure and an honor, really beyond belief, to be able to have you on my channel and to have this information there. And you're doing such great work, Ben. And I want everyone who's listening, watching, please follow Ben. Please.
You can, so my Substack is it's benryan.substack.com, benryan.substack.com. I write about pediatric gender medicine all the time. And my website is benryan.net, and on X, I'm Ben Ryan Writer.
Great. And you do great work, and you're an awesome human, and I feel very happy to have you as a friend. And let's just keep doing the work, putting the reality, and it's all about facts. It's just facts. Facts, people. Facts. and so with that, thanks everybody for joining us. I'll see you Wednesday on the live, and all the information is in the description of the video. So have a great day, everybody. I'll see you all later. Thanks for joining us.